know that this book, First Kings, can be divided into three parts. Three parts. So when you study, have this in mind, structure in mind. First part is about Solomon. First part is about Solomon. And second part is about kingdom divided. Then we have good story here and the kingdom divided. And then our third part is about prophet Elijah. Solomon, kingdom divided, and the prophet Elijah. So we have this, chapter 11 is about the last days of King Solomon. So after this, we're going to move on to other story. And King Solomon, as we know, of course, he was a king of wisdom. He asked wisdom and he earned a lot more than wisdom. He's a king of wisdom, but his later years were not beautiful. So if you read carefully the story of King Solomon, it's not all beautiful stories. It's all about him marrying many, many women. And him worshiping other idols. And him having rebellion in his own kingdom. So the examples are like this. The surrounding tribes. Israel have old surrounding tribes. They were conquered or subdued during the King David's time. So King David, contrast to his well-known image of shepherd, he's a king of warrior, king of battle, king of war. And he conquered or subdued many, many surrounding tribes. But now those tribes start to rebel against Solomon in his later years. And his servant, Solomon's servant's son, Jeroboam, led northern Israel, and now the kingdom was divided into two. So now Solomon, in his later years, we see his tragic events happening over and over again. And the climax is chapter 11. The fact that Solomon had nearly 1,000 wives was not just a moral flaw, but it was a spiritual defect. And looking at the origins of his wives, we can see what Solomon based his rule on. So he had governed his kingdom based on, not on God, but on something else. And we can know what it is by looking at the origins of his wives. He relied on military power. Verse 1, chapter 11, verse 1 says, he loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter. And earlier in chapter 3, we read that Solomon took Pharaoh's daughter as a wife and brought her to the city of David. So he started with one woman, and now he grew 1,000. This was a common military alliance marriage of ancient times. Though it's a story from after Solomon's time, Israel's traditional strategy, due to its geopolitical position, was this: to counter the threats of Assyrian in the northeast and Babylon in the east. They relied on military might on Egypt, the strongest power in the west. And in case Egypt was too far to help, Solomon had a backup plan. That is Moab, Ammon, Edom, Sidon, and Hittites in verse 1. So if you look at the map of Israel, ancient Israel, Moab and Ammon to the east of Israel, Edom and Hittites to the south of Israel, Sidon on the western coast, where all Canaanite people living adjacent to Israel. So these are the names of the tribes that are living close to Israel. Israel had taken the promised land through Joshua, but for hundreds of years afterward, they couldn't fully drive out the foreigners living there. So when Israel was weak, like Solomon's time, they were harassed by them. But in the strongest time of King David, they coexisted in the same land. Now Solomon made alliance with them, this close tribe, the tribes nearby. He made alliance with them to prepare for invasions from the larger nations beyond. So he had his strategy of having alliance with Egypt to protect from Assyria and Babylon. And now he's a buffer countries around him to protect even more. Through these marriages, he could secure military stability and protection, but there was a spiritual cost he paid. So he had married to the daughter of Pharaoh afar in Egypt. And now he had many marriage relationships with the tribes around him. But he thought he could secure military stability, but he had to pay the spiritual cost. The first was he failed to trust God alone. He failed to trust God alone because of all these alliances that he had. Now Solomon, with the mighty military power of Egypt, the greatest and oldest nation of the time, secured an alliance formed through also marriage with surrounding nations. Now Solomon no longer had a reason to trust only God. So before, when the Israel was weak and small, they needed to rely on God alone. That was their confession. That was their reason to existence. But now Solomon's tragedy was having too many things to rely on, too many options to rely on, too many things to choose. And God became one of them. Now Solomon failed to rely on God alone. That was first danger or first spiritual price that he had to pay. The second danger, second price he had to pay was idolatry. Naturally leads from failing worship God alone. Now he has this idolatry. All these women Solomon brought were of royal descent from their respective nations. In the ancient world, where politics and religion were not separate, these royal wives naturally brought the gods they served in their homelands and their worship customs. So look at the verse 5. You see all these names of Ashtoreth, the goddess of Sidonians, and Milcom, the detestable god of Ammonites. And verse 7, Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and Molech, the detestable god of Ammon. These are just some of the gods behind Solomon's 1,000 concubines. So not only these 5 gods and worship practices, he had more gods and more worship practices happening in Jerusalem. And what is more tragic is in verse 8. It says, Solomon did the same for all his foreign wives. Not only these 4 to 5 women and their gods, but he did the same for all his foreign wives. 1,000 wives, he did the same. Imagine a scene in a small city like Jerusalem, where 1,000 women and their servants and their priests and the worshippers, they offer sacrifices to their gods, asking their gods' decision for big and small matters, and compete in secret to influence Solomon. Now there was no difference between Jerusalem and the high place of Gibeon we looked at in chapter 3. So now Jerusalem, the supposedly place to worship God alone, it became no difference from the high place of Gibeon, worshiping God and idols together. That is exactly why God warned them not to make covenant or marry with those in the promised land. Of course, Solomon had reasons for these choices. As I explained to you earlier, the land of Israel was laid between 2 empires considered the most powerful in the ancient world. To their west, Egypt had always been the strongest nation for thousands of years. In their east was Mesopotamia, where rising nations in their region always ran powerful empires, Chaldean Ur, Babylon, and Persia in succession. So for a small nation like Israel to survive between these 2 giant empires, there seems to be only one way: to have ally with the stronger side and keep weaker surrounding tribes as a buffer. So in chapter 3, we read Solomon's first marriage to Pharaoh's daughter as a beginning of this strategy. Having this marriage with Pharaoh's daughter, now Solomon thought that he secured the protection. He secured the military power. Solomon probably didn't intend to have nearly 1,000 concubines from the beginning. But look how the number has grown within this chapter 3 and 11. Solomon might have thought Egypt alone as a solid ally would suffice. He didn't think he needed more wives to marry. But here's what we must know when relying on worldly power. There's no such thing as this is the last time. It never ends with one. Once you compromise, once you rely on worldly wisdom, it grows, and it expands. Once Solomon relied on Egypt, he started worrying about the smaller nations between Egypt and Israel. And he might have thought, they're weak now, they're small now, but what if they grow strong and harass us later? What if they invade before Egypt can save us? So he began making covenants and marriages with those nations too. Now his options grew from one to many. Now he started to think, what if Mesopotamia invades from the east? So let's make Moab and Ammon friends to create a buffer. And since enemy might come by the sea, northwest, let's ally with Sidon, the port city. So what seemed like it would end with Egypt grew into 1,000 wives. That's why we have chapter 11, he has 1,000 wives. So once it starts, it can never be stopped. So the great danger to our faith is not betrayal or apostasy. We don't suddenly deny God one day and turn to idol worship. Our faith doesn't weaken because someone threatens us to deny the Lord or lock us up. Look at China's underground church, fastest growing on earth under communist oppression. Persecution, oppression, apostasy are not our greatest dangers. The greatest danger to our faith is compromise, just one compromise. As seen with the Gibeon high place in chapter 3, serving both God and idols is the biggest threat to God's people. So in ancient time, they likely thought it natural to pray to Baal for farming because he is a god of prosper, and Ashtoreth for traveling the sea. Ashtoreth is the goddess of the sea. It might be natural to pray to mountain gods for mountains and plains gods for battles on plains. So compromise can seem reasonable. It seems wiser to have many options for them. They probably thought instead of making peace with mid-sized neighbors, let's ally with Egypt through marriage. But again, the problem is once compromise is made, it expands, it grows. Once you turn from God to rely on worldly power, problems you never noticed before start standing out. So in this stage, our standard of faith begins to blur. Solomon may have started with a simple marriage, just one marriage, but later he built high places at his wife's request, and he turned the whole city of Jerusalem into a place of idol worship. One compromise leads to another and eventually consuming the entire city, making Jerusalem no different from the Gibeon high place. So the result of compromise is spiritual numbness and destruction. At first, you may feel guilty and shameful, but over time, you grow numb and end up cutting off yourselves with God. And Isaiah says, our sins have separated us from our God. So I think Solomon's life in this period must have been exhausting. Having 1,000 wives is not something that he enjoyed. It must have been exhausting. Verse 8 says, he did the same for all his 14 wives. And behind this verse 8, we must be able to read his tiredness. With 700 wives and 300 concubines and all the idols behind them, how busy and weary must his life have been to satisfy them all equally. The daily life of someone managing life with worldly wisdom only is not peace and rest, but a tiring, busy, and worn-out routine. It is not a life unified as one, but a patchwork stitched together from here and there. There were likely a time in your lifetime when you relied on one God only. Every problem's answer was God, and you confessed with your lives, not just your lips, that God was greater than all the worries and fears of your circumstances. But now, it is as if God is just one of many options, one of many solutions. And there seems to be multiple solutions to the problems in your lives. It is, spiritually speaking, like the 1,000 altars in Jerusalem, buzzing with chaos, pulling Solomon from 1,000 directions. So our life commitment, once we made one compromise, it grew, and now we have 1,000 commitment pull us from every direction, not making us fail to worship God alone. So having many options, many solutions is a good thing if only this solved your life problems. But it doesn't. You have probably experienced problems arising from the very places you trusted most, the ones you relied on most. In Solomon's case, trouble first came from Edom, a place the closest to him. The southeast part of Israel, Edom, the problem came from there. Verse 14 says, Hadad of Edom's royal line caused trouble. So the history between Edom and Israel, long ago, David's commander Joab spent 6 months in that land killing every male. But this guy, young Hadad, survived and he fled to Egypt. He traveled to Egypt and later he became Pharaoh's brother-in-law. When he heard David was dead, Hadad returned to Edom and rebelled against Solomon. Now see here, we see the pattern that Solomon secured stability through marriage with Pharaoh, but the problem came through that marriage. This Hadad became another marriage relationship with Pharaoh. And verse 23 introduces another rebellion. Rezon, son of Eliada, who fled from his master Hadad-ezel, king of Zobah, built an army in Damascus and opposed Solomon. So here, briefly speaking, from the southwest, Hadad, and from the northeast, Rezon, both closest to Israel, became headaches for Solomon. And it is again rebellion coming through exact the same way that Solomon secured his stability. Solomon's trusted system of stability through marriage and military power collapsed by that very method. He married Pharaoh's daughter, but Hadad married too. And he became powerful, became an enemy of Solomon. He surely had a marriage tie with Zobah too, but his servant who fled his royalty became his foe, and now he is harassing Solomon. So we see this pattern. When we rely on worldly wisdom and power, we have the problem right from there. So this issue did not just arise suddenly. It is a result of Solomon's compromise piled up. Now, trouble started internally too. Not only Edomites, not only Zobah. Now, Solomon has a problem internally. Jeroboam, son of Nebat, Solomon's servant, rebelled and became his enemy. So his own people, Israel, rebelled against Solomon and became a different nation. It was more shocking and a climactic event because it happened within Israel. But this was not sudden again. It was a natural outcome of how Solomon lived for decades. Solomon has chosen compromising, and it all piled up. Now the consequence is the division of the kingdom. So the author of 1 Kings intentionally used this image of division. His kingdom is divided, as well as his concern was divided. His attention was divided into 1,000 wives. Solomon's focus was not God alone, but it grew into Egypt and God, and Ammon and Egypt and God, and Moab and Ammon and Egypt and God, and until finally the kingdom itself was divided. So it was very intentional that the author is emphasizing the dividing image here. When you have a divided commitment, when you compromise and you divide your commitment to God and other things, then you will have division within yourself too. In our faith, there is a moment like 1 Kings chapter 3, when Solomon first brought in Pharaoh's daughter. It seemed like a small decision, one we thought we would get past justice once and never repeat. But that is a compromise, very significant compromise. And the truth is, compromise never ends with one time. In result, without us knowing, it produces something like 1,000 wives. And we grow busy and weary from all this divided commitment. And in trying to satisfy everyone equally, we abandon the one God we should satisfy. And the problems start arising from the very places we felt safest and relied on most. At the moment, we must once again remember the faithful promise of God. Ironically, we have to go back to the prayer of Solomon in chapter 8. When he prayed, your people, when your people lose in war due to rebellion, when your people are taken to a far land or suffer famine. And Solomon prayed that when we turn to you and pray to you one more time, once again, please remember us. That was Solomon's prayer, and we need that prayer in chapter 8. And it is when your life seems to be pulling you from 1,000 directions, when your life seems to have the problem that from where you have most relied on. It is a time that we now turn to Jesus, turn to God, and offer our undivided worship toward God's temple. Let us pray together.